أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to the video Truth Speakers and Justice Seekers. This video is going to be about, well, I'm actually creating a series of videos in which simple metaphors for efficient communication of the sociopathic enslavement process. That's kind of the title of the series, but this particular video in the series is on the value of using metaphors to efficiently communicate your experience of sociopathic victimization. And so one of the values of using metaphor to communicate your experience of sociopathic victimization is that you're able to efficiently communicate your experience because you bypass the need to explain yourself. So often as sociopathic victims, we're often feeling the need to explain ourselves. We feel kind of helpless. We feel like we have to justify ourselves and rationalize ourselves because we're in such a disadvantageous position. For example, I was 32 and my father actually used the Mental Health Act of 2006 to have me for my liberty to be taken from me for about 2 weeks in a mental institution against my will. And so he was able, when he did that, the backstory that him and my narcissistic family could construct about me was that I was 32 and still dependent on my father. But the real progression is that even at 30, when I went off and was trying to go do my own type of business, he's the one who seduced me back, who influenced me to come back and take money from him. And my brother and sister who supported his claims at the coroner's office were actually instrumental in him getting me to come back to financially depend on him. And the whole context is that he's repeatedly sabotaged my kind of like progress in life, becoming financially independent, by putting himself in a position where I'm reliant on him, and through promissory estoppel, leading to detrimental reliance, just constantly driving my life downwards, right? So because I'm in such a disadvantageous position, often I feel like the need to kind of explain myself, like, why am I in this position? It's not because of me, it's not my mistake, it's like he keeps doing these things. And when I try to tell my story, it brings up that helplessness, right? So in is to bypass that, I've learned that when you use metaphor that are relatable, universally relatable to everyone, you don't really trigger your own emotionality, really, or at least it's easier not to. Also, it's clear, concise communication without triggering your own emotions, like I said, and it's eliciting particular experience from the lives of the listener to provoke sympathy, right? So it's like you're giving this, really what the nature of metaphor is, it's this summation of the array of facts that's like immediately communicable, right? That's what a metaphor is. It's like this summation of the array of facts that's immediately communicable, where instead of telling you 1,000 miniature stories, I can just kind of reveal the structure of the story to you in a simple metaphor, right? So it summates these vast facts. And the other benefit of it is when I share that metaphor with you, what's going to happen is the structure of the metaphor that's meaningful is going to trigger particular memories from your own experience, right? So you have your own memories that kind of like are associated with that metaphorical structure, and I have my own memories that are associated with that metaphorical structure. But when I try to share my stories with you, and they're kind of jumbled and there's a lot of details, and I'm not able to communicate that clearly. But when I give you a simple metaphor, immediately what happens is your particular memories are triggered. So, for example, let me give you, and that fills in the details, and that's influential. The person immediately feels sympathetic toward you. Where if you told your story, the accidentals of the story might have them actually sympathize with someone else or whatever. But the metaphor, the structure immediately elicits sympathy from the other person. And so let me give you a particular, like, most people who are listening to this are going to be people who've been victimized by sociopaths. And even if you're not, just as an exercise, just try this on. I'll give you a few metaphors and see whether or not it kind of triggers. It might not, because now I'm telling you, but it triggers particular experiences in your memory that kind of fit the structure, right? especially if you have been through a process of victimization by a sociopath. So one thing is, one metaphor is like they always move the goalposts, right? You can never win because the goalposts are already are like moving all the time. So now you have to go 100 miles to get to this end, and all of a sudden you go 70 miles, and now you have to go 200 miles, right? So now all of a sudden you're spent at 70 miles, your mental expectations, and now you have to go 200 miles, or you need to get the ball 20 miles down the field, and all of a sudden you get 15 miles there, and it's only 5 miles away, and all of a sudden they move it 100 miles forward or 100 yards forward. You see what I'm saying? And so they're always literally moving the goalpost to where you can never win, right? And so that's one way of thinking about it. I like to build metaphor upon metaphor. So the first metaphor is a natural one, which is like there's something in our experience which we can map that onto. But then just to take it to a ridiculous level, to iterate the structure of the metaphor, but in kind of like going meta one level, I'll say like we were playing basketball and I was trying to score a hoop, and all of a sudden instead of a hoop there's a soccer goal there, right? And I'm confused. I don't know what to do. Right? There's a soccer goal, and we were on a court playing basketball, and all of a sudden the field's different. All of a sudden, the goal is different, and I don't know what the goal is because from this moment to this moment, the, the world I'm living in is completely different, right? Okay. Let me just give you another one. It's like standing on shifting sands. So like you're standing and the sand, like the more you struggle to stand or get out of the sand, your struggle actually sinks you. So your only kind of choice is to stand still and sink slowly, or if you move and struggle a lot, you sink faster. And think about like if you're born into that, like for example, so people who like were healthy and are slowly like enslaved by a sociopath, that's something different. And that's often not fully possible for like a healthy person. But say you're born, like your dad's a sociopath and you're born a son to him. So you're born into that process. Your whole personality is fostering. Of course, your parents raise you to be codependent. They foster that codependence in you. And so you're born standing on shifting sands, right? You're born standing on shifting sands. Another So what do you do in that situation, right? Like you're not accustomed to anything. It's like being born in Plato's cave where all you've ever known is the shadows on the wall, and the person who like that's all you've ever known. So all you've ever known is that there's no stability to reality. It's like the laws of physics are changing all the time, right? It's like the laws of physics are continuously different. You're living in a different universe, like every few days, every few years, every few months. Like it's always shifting the universe you're living in. Or it's kind of like an elephant, right? Like when it's a baby, when it's really tiny or small, all you have to do is tie its leg to a goalpost, right? It's like you tie it to a tree, and what'll happen is it's going to pull at the tree or at the post, and it's not going to be able to uproot the post because it's a baby elephant and the post is really in there, right? But what happens is if it grows up like that, it learns to be helpless. It learns like that when it's tied to the post, it won't be able to go anywhere. And so by the time it grows up, it's huge, and if it wanted, it could easily pull out the post. But instead of easily pulling out the post, it just accustomed to not being able to, and so there's this learned helplessness that happens, right? You feel helpless and you just feel tied and like you're in prison or something. um the laws of physics. And so those are just some metaphors. I'll stop there. Just to name, I'm not going to go into these metaphors, but just to name a few, like depending on what the context you're in, it also is important, right? Like if you're arguing in a court of law, so appealing to the American Revolution or the patriotic sentimentality, or those type of metaphors. Or if you're even in a court of law, or just like Judeo-Christian values in Western society, if you want to appeal to a sense of morality, you can use the metaphor of prophets and Israel, because Israel like versus the prophets. I'm not making a political point here, but like Israel versus the prophets. So the prophets represent truth and justice, and the call toward that, and monotheism, and whereas Israel represents idolatry and injustice and falsehood, right? And I'm making a biblical kind of, I'm not making a political point, I'm making a biblical reference here, right, as a metaphor. So if you want to make a moral point, appeal to religiosity, you can kind of use that metaphor. King George, tyranny and the American Revolution, um, all these things. Okay, so that's sufficient metaphors. It wasn't really my goal to go into that, but you see how, like, even as you're listening to what I'm saying to you and I'm describing the metaphor, it might be triggering certain associations, and you might actually be having particular insights into your own experiences. And see, when we speak about metaphors, we use, this is one of the reasons Christ used a lot of metaphors, is because when you speak in metaphors, you give people like the wisdom, you give people an array of facts or the structure of the array of facts, right? And what happens is they can fill in details all of a sudden that they know the structure. They can take experiences and put them into the structure and kind of see for themselves that how the structure actually applies to their own life. Because often, in our society, in America, a lot of times people are having experiences with sociopaths. I would say at least 50-60%, if not 80-90% people are on the narcissistic spectrum. And I would say the most successful, the most people of authority and influence tend to have the most sociopathic tendencies nowadays. And so everyone's had encountered with people above them in power who act this way in relationship to them, right? But they can't articulate it. And so when we articulate metaphors motivated to communicate our own experience of sociopathic victimization or sociopathic enslavement, what happens is we're actually waking people up to their own experience of that. So it's kind of a mutual thing. Like, it's valuable to them and it's valuable to us. Okay, so let me give you 7 points on the nature of metaphor, which will really drive this point home on why you need to be using metaphors to communicate your experience of sociopathic victimization. It's Metaphors communicate the array of diverse facts efficiently. Metaphors communicate um, the array of diverse facts efficiently. That's point one. There's seven. This is the motive of metaphor and accomplished by apt metaphors. So if the metaphor is good, if it's a really good metaphor, this is what it'll accomplish. This is the whole motive of metaphor in language, is to communicate the array of facts efficiently. So you need to select the appropriate metaphor for the particular context, and you need to use it or deploy it. Because they speak to our intuition, they access the subconscious directly. So because these metaphors are speaking to our intuition or our unconscious mind or to our subconscious mind, what they do is they stimulate emotion, right? All of a sudden, like, emotion is triggered, and all the memories that are associated with that emotion that you're triggering by using the metaphor boil to the surface, and they appeal to the conscious mind of the individual. Like, they experience the conscious, there's a conscious recall, and they experience in their own mind everything that is associated with the emotion or the structure, metaphorical structure, which you're kind of communicating in the moment. So it's the most influential way of communicating. You're really, in most cases, going to elicit a strongly sympathetic response for it. Um, this makes them devastatingly influential, right? This nature of metaphor makes it devastatingly influential, especially, now this is an important point, especially if metaphor is iterated, fleshed out progressively with each iteration, and multiple metaphors are deployed. So what you mean by this is, like, so you share a metaphor. So say I tell you a cult or a sociopath and his network of relationships is like a wolf pack. It's like a cannibalistic wolf pack where they're hunting their own species in a pack, and they'll hunt other packs, like they'll hunt non-cannibalistic wolf packs, and they'll actually cannibalize one of their own relatives if that relative chooses not to be a cannibal wolf, right? So if now I said that, and now I move on and I say, for example, I'll move on to the next point for a second, is that they are especially useful to communicate difficulty and familiar experiences as a sociopathic victimization. So one of the reasons metaphors are so powerful is because they communicate difficult and unfamiliar experiences, such as sociopathic victimization, efficiently. And when an experience is unfamiliar, it can be unrelatable, and so it needs to be communicated efficiently. So, like for going back to the metaphor of the wolf pack, like a cannibalistic wolf pack, one of the way like wolf packs experience themselves, one of the way the wolf packs will function is that the dominant wolf, the alpha wolf, has its place, and every single wolf in the category has a place down to the omega wolf. And so if the omega wolf, because it's the most disadvantaged in the pack, won't cannibalize other wolves because it feels kind of whatever compassion or care for the other wolves, all the omega wolves and all the other wolves will actually cannibalize their own relative, their own wolf. But really what they do is like they're cannibals who are leeching the energy and drinking the blood of other wolves, right? So it's unnatural. And so like for example, now I don't know if how good a job I did, but see how I mentioned the metaphor, a few sentences back, and then I left it, and then I went and talked about other stuff, and then I came back to the metaphor and started using it again and describing things and fleshing out the metaphor again. And remember how when I was talking about the metaphors, like a whole bunch of them, there's a whole bunch of metaphors to talk about, right? And so when you talk about a lot of metaphors, and maybe you do where you're talking about a bunch of metaphors and they all associate with one another, and then you leave it and then you come back, and then you leave it and then you come back, there's a profound effect of doing that, right? People will start to get what you're saying, and they're going to feel emotion, and because you're appealing to a very structure that exists inside of them and you're evoking it, they will know the truth. They're going to recognize that you're speaking the truth, right? You can only do that when something is really really true, right? It's difficult to do that about false things. um, so when you do this, there is kind of like there's really something beneficial that happens. The last, let me like make the last 2 points really quickly. They are especially useful to communicate difficulty and unfamiliar experiences such as sociopathic victimization. So I'm a 32-year-old devoutly religious Muslim man, right? And so maybe from Louisiana, and so maybe there's some black female 19-year-old from Seattle, Washington, and for whatever reason I need to communicate my experience to her. So if I talk about how my dad was an immigrant and he used Islam as a way of controlling us, and how he used to talk about how Catholicism was so weird because it wouldn't let the priests have sex, and then, during my teenage years, he wanted me to be sexless, and he manipulated during my 20s to constantly delay like marriage and all these type of things. And he was just he was just a hypocrite, you know what I mean? And so if I try to describe this to her, she might have some feminist beliefs. She might have been victimized by a man rather than a woman. Like she might have been victimized by her mom, and her dad might have actually been a good guy. Maybe she has some, maybe she was what you call it, she was abused, like sexually abused and stuff. And so for me, I was sexually deprived during the years that were most I needed it. And for here, it was like sexual abuse, right? So if I share the particulars of my story to this person, it might not be relatable. It might actually trigger them to dislike me or not to feel sympathy, even though the deep structure of our experience is identical, right? So, but when I use metaphor to communicate, they can fill in the details of their own personal experience. And once there's a bond, once there's trust, once there's unity, once there's participation in that metaphorical structure, then we can talk about the details safely because we realize that the deep structure of our experience is identical, right? Especially if you use multiple metaphors to communicate it. Lastly, the quick the quick communication and efficient summation of your experience of victimization, the details of which are filled in by the person themselves. So these are all related points. They are all like when I start commentating on one, they relate to the other one. I think I've already given you most of the good metaphors that I had in place. I actually remembered two that I had forgotten while I was talking to you guys. So I'll end the video there. I hope it was beneficial. Please like, please subscribe, comment below, leave me feedback. I'm very open. I really appreciate critical feedback, and at the moment I would appreciate some appreciative feedback too. But I really welcome critical feedback, and I welcome, please don't attack my person. Like, you can criticize me, I'm inviting it, I welcome it, I love it, but attacking someone's person is hurtful. So please don't do that, and I will talk to you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.